As you see from the title here, I want to talk briefly about what has become a very contentious debate in the United States over the effectiveness of batters programs, and whether we should even have batters programs or whether they are a false promise to battered women and whether they merely divert funds away from victim services, whether they should be replaced or not by other approaches. And when I speak of batters programs, in the United States, the predominant model, as probably many of you know, either from literature that you've read or heard, things you've heard about, or what you do in your own country, could be categorized as a gender-based cognitive behavioral approach. And by that I mean that we focus primarily on the behavior of concern, the violence and abuse against one's partner, and we challenge and work with the cognitive aspects, the beliefs and attitudes that tend to reinforce that behavior. And those attitudes are often rooted in beliefs about gender, particularly distortions about manhood and womanhood that ultimately need to be exposed and explored with men. The vast majority of the men that come to these programs are referred by the courts and required to attend the programs as part of their sentence. And in the United States, the vast majority of the arrest cases that make it to the courts end up in batters programs, unless it's a very, very severe case and this is a repeat offender, which I believe is different in Israel, where also a greater portion of men who've been violent or abusive towards their partners end up in jail. About 20 to 25% of the cases that end up in court are what we call dual arrest. That is, that both the man and the woman have been arrested for violence, perhaps reflecting some of that mutual and situational violence that we've heard talked about earlier in the day. And in these cases, the women are, depending on the severity of their violence and their circumstance, may also be sent to a separate group for support and counseling. But basically in the men's group, I think there's the adage that prevails that says that you need to stop your violence and learn how to stop your violence, regardless of what your partner does, or regardless of what your friends may coach you into or say is what you should be doing. This is much like the treatment and alcohol field that says you need to learn to stop your drinking regardless of what your partner does or regardless of what your friends do. The debate over batters programs, and particularly this approach that I just mentioned, obviously stems from some theoretical differences about what is the cause of domestic violence and how best to help people change. It's also reinforced or fueled, you might say, by some of the political issues out there about funding and territory, you might say, as well. And at one end of the spectrum, you might say, are those that are very emphatic that batters programs, as they prevail in the United States, need to be dismantled and replaced by psychodynamic and couples-oriented approaches, that they don't address sufficiently the psychological issues behind violence and the dyadic or relationship issues behind domestic violence. Then I guess you might say there's more of a moderate position that says that we really need to revise extensively the programs that we have, and you might say differentiate them more, that there's different kinds of batters, different kinds of issues that the men bring to the programs, and we need to specialize or tailor our programs to those men, to the different issues and the different types of men that come to batters programs. And then there's the other position, which I'll try to argue for or defend, you might say, here in our session, and that is that basically batters programs as they are a good foundation for our intervention and a useful one, but they are evolving for sure, and that what really is at issue is more the implementation of these programs within the community at large. That really to improve batterer programs overall, what may be the most important thing is to improve the system of which it is a part, its linkages to the court, its association with women's services, and its dealings with other social services in the community. Much of the debate over which direction we should be going is rooted in the evidence-based practice movement, what Chris Sullivan was referring to before, this demand for substantiation from program evaluations, evidence that shows that your particular approach is effective and, in fact, more effective than other approaches. And this evidence-based practice demand, you know, I think comes from a real need to sort out a lot of different approaches and theories throughout not only the domestic violence field, but the mental health field and for that matter, the medical field at large, and to make our programs and interventions more efficient and more effective, and ultimately, especially this is the case in the United States, to help us determine where to put our very limited dollars. In a time of tremendous fiscal constraint, there's more and more debate over how we can best use those limited dollars we have. But the question becomes, and the challenge for us is, I think, in this debate is, whose evidence should we use to answer those questions about evidence-based practice, and whose interpretation of that evidence is the most appropriate? When I look over this debate and the evidence that's out there, I come up with this sort of summary of where things are. There's 5 what we would call experimental studies showing that there's very little effect of batterers programs. And this is particularly important since within the evidence-based practice movement, experimental designs and experimental evaluations are considered to be the gold standard. And by experimental designs, I mean it's kind of what we do in the medical field to determine if a medicine is effective and should be approved and for use in the greater population. We randomly assign men who come into the courts to either a batterers program of one kind or another, and then a control group that has no treatment or some alternative approach, and then compare the results overall. And the key there is that random assignment, sorting people out as they come in. One person goes here, and then the next person goes here. So we have 2 groups that are very similar at the end that we can compare. But then there's also those, one of the issues around that is, though, that random assignment is really difficult to do in the real world, especially in the criminal justice system within the courts. And so there's a lot of methodological shortcomings that those experimental designs end up not being a pure experiment. They're less rigorous than the ideal would want it to be. Then there's another way of looking at this, and a whole different set of evidence that says we have, like I was suggesting earlier, to look at batterers programs within the larger system of which they're a part. Whether that system is functional or dysfunctional, the outcomes of the batterers programs are tremendously influenced by the action and oversight of the court, the response of the probation people, and other services that men and their partners may be receiving in the community. There's also a good deal of research emerging around a variety of different alternative approaches for dealing with domestic violence cases. But I think I can summarize, although this is being very, very superficial, I admit, that research in and of itself is still at an emergent stage, and that it may, over time, so there's a lot of contradictions in the outcomes of that research, and there isn't, you might say, substantial research within our own field that shows yet that one approach of these alternative approaches is superior or more effective to the existing approaches. And furthermore, there is research from other fields that suggests that that where these alternatives have been more thoroughly studied and evaluated, that they are more effective necessarily in those other fields. So there are some legitimate doubts about the alternatives that are being posed, at least at this stage. And that's not to say we dismiss them outright, but it's to say that the prevailing approach still has some legitimacy in and of itself. The last two things that sort of stand out to me when I look over this research is that to really move the field forward, and what seems to be the direction at hand, is doing more risk assessment and risk management. And by that I mean being able to identify the real problematic, unresponsive, difficult cases that give batterer programs a bad name up front, and bring to those cases more supervision, more services, and more support for their partners. The biggest problem overall is having the resources and the organization in the community at large, what we call that coordinated community response that you've heard referred to earlier, to have that functioning at a level that makes a difference. That the real challenge for the field, I think from my outside view here, is better implementation, is improving the links with the courts and other services through risk management in a way that really decisively and extensively deals with these really problematic and troubling cases. Well, let me first look briefly at the experimental evaluations, because those are the heart of you might say, the dissent and opposition to the existing batters programs. There's been 5 of these experimental studies, as I've said, that have been funded by the government, and they are real difficult to implement. And in particular, what we run into is what we call overrides. That about 30% of the cases that should have been assigned to these studies end up being pulled out of the study because either the advocate or the judge or the lawyer wants those cases to receive a different treatment than they're assigned. So we end up with these experiments not necessarily being representative of the men as a whole that go to batterers program. And these studies have had terribly low response rates when they do the follow-up. That they may be, well, I guess on average you could say, or the range would be, they only contact about 20% to 40% of the women, the partners of the men, to get a sense of the outcome. And that's not representative either as a whole of the victims that are out there. One other really quick issue is that the experimental studies end up with what we call an intention to treat model rather than treatment received. And by that I mean you end up with this experimental group, the people that were assigned to the batterers program, may only include, 50, and in one case, 40% of those people actually receiving the treatment because other people have dropped out. So, and then the people that went to the control group, they ended up seeking other services or interventions themselves that throw the purity of those comparisons out of balance. But the biggest criticism overall is that those studies end up failing to address the context. They don't account for the court oversight, having the man, say, put in jail if he didn't go to the batterers programs, or additional services that the woman may or may not get. This is more of what we would call a medical model, that you go, like going to the hospital if you have a broken leg to get it fixed, where in most batterers programs, going to the batterers program is just one small part of that intervention overall that includes everything from the police all the way to additional services and advocacy that the woman may receive. There's been an effort to try to summarize this research in what you may hear at times called meta-analyses. And people often refer to, rather than to all the studies, they refer to the meta-analyses, these summaries where they put all the studies together to determine, try to do a summary of the effectiveness. And at least probably the most thorough and prestigious of these meta-analyses, as you see in this quote on the board, say basically, from these experiments, they may be the gold standard, but the quality of them is sufficiently low that we simply don't know whether the interventions help and whether they have no effect or whether they are harmful based on this information. So for a variety of different reasons, we need to go further and not only look at the experimental research, look at and consider its flaws, but weigh it against also other evidence. And I would say that evidence would be the research and evaluation that's taken a more, rather than a medical model, viewed things more from a systems analysis or a systems perspective. There's been about 6 different systems evaluations, and those, by and large, show positive effects. And the most comprehensive one is one that we did some years ago, a multi-site evaluation. We looked at batters programs in 4 different cities, and those batters programs were, each one of them were set in a very different system. One was a shorter program was situated, for instance, in a system where the court reviewed and monitored the case every month to assure that the men were participating in the program, and if they weren't, they received additional sanctions as a result. We did a 4-year longitudinal follow-up. We interviewed the men and their partners every 3 months, and we had a response rate of 70% for at least 30 months and 60% for over the full 4 years with over 12,000 interviews. Now, to try to make sense of this, given that if you just look at the people that completed the programs and those that didn't complete the programs in what they call a quasi-experimental evaluation, we did something called statistical modeling, and that is with big samples and a lot of variables and data, we were able to simulate with our sample an experiment. In other words, select out men that were very similar in their characteristics who didn't complete the program with those that did complete the program. So you simulate an experiment through these approaches, and you're also able to take in consideration the context, and that is the activity of the court, and the police, the other services that are in the town, and sort of isolate or control for those so you get how the batters program looks within this bigger system. And in our study and another one that was done with arrests, we found that men who completed the program were 50% less likely to abuse their partner than those that had little or no treatment. And still, that's a very conservative outcome given the men that received the men that we were comparing to still got some treatment or another, even though they didn't complete the program as a whole. A couple of other things stand out to us. When you look at just the cumulative, the reoffense rate overall, it doesn't look that good in the sense that men physically abused their partner. About 30% of them did so within 15 months, and over 40% did over the 4 years. That's any time during the follow-up did they ever hit their partner. But when you look at the trend that we saw over time, over 80% of the men had not assaulted a partner physically in the previous 30 months, in the previous year at the end of the 30 months. I realize that's a very complicated idea, but let me try it again. The idea is that the assaults that men are involved in, not to minimize or neglect those, but the when men reassault, the majority of them tended to do so early on when they were still in the program and learning about how to stop their violence. But then overall, in the long term, the vast majority of them stopped their violence for long periods of time. So that's an encouraging thing overall. And it said to us that one size fit most of the men, although there was a core of men, almost 20%, that re-abused their partner early on and continuously through the follow-up. And these were, high-risk, very dangerous men. These are the men that give batterers programs a bad name. And the ones that we need to tend more to. If we could deal more effectively with that particular group, our outcomes would look very good. They obviously need more than just batterer programs. Two other things that stood out to us was that the influence of the court's response and the court's oversight and other services on the outcomes. That if there was greater, or if the women had more contact with women's services or battered women's services, there was also more likely to be a decrease in the violence. If the men were involved in substance abuse treatment, there was more likely to be a decrease in domestic violence. So I'm jumping to the grand finale here. I jumped too far, since I have 2 minutes left or so. So overall, I think I'm probably reiterating what I said at the beginning, but for just emphasis, I think if we're to better resolve this debate, or not necessarily to resolve it, but at least temper it, I think the issue for us, especially in the research community, is to broaden our view of the evidence and consider not only the experimental studies, but also these system studies that are, I think, pointing us in a further direction, a direction beyond just the batterers programs in and of themselves. And ultimately, I think, rather than spending more and more money and attention with the majority of the men that come to the batterers programs and eventually do reasonably well, I think the real challenge for us is to better identify that really problematic, dangerous, high-risk group of men that seem to be falling through the gaps. And this means, overall, really working in our communities to enhance what we refer to often as that coordinated community response. Making the intervention not just a batterers program where we send men off in a corner or into a room, but involving the community more broadly to deal with these cases, whether they be the problematic ones or the men that seem more responsive. So with that, I'll thank you all again for the chance to be here and join you, and wish you well in your work.